In the last section, we implemented the button portion of our dropdown, but now we need to figure out how to make the button actually respond to when it's clicked. Fortunately, React provides a really easy way to deal with click events on our pages. In React, there are several on type events that you get triggered by default inside React. And they include stuff like on clicking a element, on focusing it, on changing something, etc., etc. And they all work the same way that jQuery events work. You pass in a function to an event handler, and then whenever the user triggers that event, the function will get called. So as a very quick example here, I can say on clicking this button right here, we're inside button.jsx, by the way, I want you to call this dot handle click. So whenever this button component right here gets clicked, it will say, okay, I'm going to go and look for a function called handle click on this component right here, and I'm going to run it. So let's define that really quick. And we'll say whenever a user clicks on the button, we will alert button clicked. I am going to make sure that gulp is running here really quick. Looks like it is. And then I'm going to refresh our page and click on the button. Great, so button was clicked. Again, we added a click handler by saying on click, and then whenever on click gets called or gets triggered, it should run this function, this.handle click right here. There are several other on type events, and they are tied to different types of components. So if we had, for some reason in here, a input, we could say on change. Or if we had another input, and on change just says, whenever the text inside of the input changes, then run this function right here. We could also say on key press, and we could say handle key press. So on this input right here, whenever someone presses a button right here, we'll run the function handle key press. The very common syntax on here for the event handlers, so the code that gets ran when the event is triggered, is to say handle and then event name. So handle click, handle change, handle key press. If you're curious about all the other different types of events in here, and we'll be dealing with several different ones, you can go to React, their homepage, and then look at the documentation. And then you'll see over here under the reference right here, event system. And it'll tell you all the different types of events. So we just looked at on key press, and that would work for an input. We can also deal with, say, mouse events. We're using on click right here. And there's all different types of events we could hook into. And they all work the same way. We say for any given event that we want to listen to, just pass it a function, and that function will get called whenever the event gets triggered. Okay, so now we know when a user clicks on a function, or excuse me, clicks on this button right here. We'll run, whenever the user clicks on the button, we'll run the function handle click. Now there's just one little problem in here. We added this click handler to button.jsx, and everything is working just fine right now, right? Well, let's think for a second. What do we want to really have happen when a user clicks the button? Inside of dropdown.jsx, we want our, and this hasn't been implemented yet, but we want basically our list right here to be shown or hidden, depending on to be toggled. We want it to be toggled depending on whether or not the user has clicked the button right here. So it's really this component that needs to know when the button has been clicked, not the button itself. So we're going to do a little bit of a refactor here, and here's what we're going to do. Instead of putting our click handler inside of button, we're going to put our click handler inside of dropdown. And we'll say hello from dropdown. Okay, so now our click handler sits inside of dropdown, but this is still trying to call this.handleClick, but this function doesn't call anymore. So we want to basically communicate from dropdown into its child component button that whenever it gets clicked, it needs to call the copy of handleClick that exists inside of dropdown over here. So to do that, we're just going to pass a reference to this function through the props object. So we're going to add another prop here, and we'll say when clicked, handle click. Excuse me, this dot handle click. So now button is going to have a property called when clicked, and it's going to point to this dot handle click. So let's make sure that button JSX actually uses this when clicked function. So now instead of saying on click run this dot handle click, we'll say this dot props dot when clicked. All right. So let's run through the code path one more time here. When we render a button component, we pass it a property when clicked that has a reference to handle click. Handle click exists inside of the dropdown component. When button renders itself, it says when I get clicked, I'm going to render, or excuse me, I'm going to call the function this.props.when clicked, which actually is pointing back to dropdown's handle click. You might ask yourself, well, why don't we just add the click handler to button right here? Why don't we just say, instead of when clicked, we could just say on click. This should show up as an event handler, and whenever someone clicks on button right here, the event handler will get called. And the answer to that is that we can't put event handlers on side of another React component. Instead, it gets passed in as a property. So if we called this instead of when clicked, if we said on click, this is not going to have any effect on the button component. It's just going to show up inside of here as this.props.onClick. Okay, now that we've gotten that far, let's make sure that gulp is running. Okay, everything looks good. And we'll refresh our page over here. And I click, and sure enough, hello from dropdown. So we clicked on the button, which called handle click that exists inside of our dropdown. All right. The fantastic thing about this is that it allows us now to have a single button component right here that we can reuse over and over again. I don't really care about the fact that that button is going to be showing different content in here. I just want to have a button component, and with just a couple little properties right here, I can hugely customize the behavior of it by just saying I want to specify a special class name, a title. Maybe I want a subtitle class name on here. Let's see what it looks like without it. And it goes away. So now all of a sudden I get something that looks like a real button, and I can click on it and I still get that drop down. So hopefully this is starting to make a little bit more sense about how when we make these reusable components right here, and I never again really have to write a button tag whenever I'm developing any application that includes this component right here. And when I say button, I'm talking about the normal HTML button, because I have this reusable button component right here that I can customize with just a couple different properties into doing wildly different things. All right, so now we have our click handler working. We get this alert message right here, but our dropdown is still not rendering a list. So let's tackle that inside the next section.